Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today, we will be looking at mapping in Charity and Academy Accounts Advanced. My name is Phil Reeves, and today I'm joined by my colleague, Tom Jeffrey. We'll just switch over. Yeah, as I said, today we're focusing specifically on the mapping in the Charity and Academy template. Tom, if you can flick us over a slide, please.
Certainly can. There we go.
This is just introducing us. Tom, if you can flick us over another slide. We'll just quickly run through the housekeeping before we get started with the webinar. So as always, we are open to questions. If you do have any questions, please submit them using the chat function or the Q&A feature. You can also raise your hand if you want to ask us a live question, and myself or Tom will unmute you. You can ask us a question live via your microphone. Today's webinar is 30 minutes, so as I say, we'll get started with the agenda, and I'll hand you over to Tom.
Thanks, Phil. Phil's actually covered most of the housekeeping there, so that's a lot of my job done. That's excellent. But yes, just to back up what Phil said there, you've got the option not only to ask us a question via the Q&A field there, but also raise your hand if you want to ask your question live. You can submit your questions throughout the session, but we're also looking to have a bit of a Q&A session at the end. I'm just going to flick over to the agenda. I'm not going to read out the agenda and bore everybody, but as you can see, we're going to be focusing on mapping in charity and academy engagements. We'll be looking at mapping in the balance sheet and the income and expenditure disclosures. Some of these disclosures will be driven by the funds analysis, which we're not going to be looking at directly today. But we will touch on that briefly. We're going to be covering the funds analysis worksheet in more detail. We've got a funds worksheet webinar in a few weeks' time. So that's another webinar that's kind of related to this one. This one sort of following on from the recent EPAC webinar, the 40503 EPAC webinar, which is available on our YouTube channel. If you missed that one, we can point you in the right direction if you need us to. Yes, that's our sort of rough agenda there. I'm going to be covering a couple of points at the beginning, and then I'll hand over to Phil, and he'll take you through some more detail a bit later on. So if we go to the next slide, we can see just an overview. This is the only slide we have, content slide we have. We are actually going to be diving into the product in a sec. But as you can see with the mapping structure, we've still got the A to H that we would find in the company Accounts Advanced template, but we do have the addition of the J codes for funds balances. Looking at income and expenditure, we have a different mapping structure really. This is a shared mapping structure between charity and academy. So rather than having, for example, L for turnover, R for admin expenses, we've got the K, KN and Y codes there. And as I say, that mapping structure is present for in charity and academy files, but there are some subtle differences between the two, and we'll be having a look at those in a bit more detail in a moment. So I'm just going to pause my screen, and I'm going to jump to my CaseWare file. So hopefully, if I resume my sharing, you can see my CaseWare file open. Hopefully you can confirm that for me, Phil.
Yes, I can see your CaseWare file.
Thank you very much. So we're in a charity file at the moment. So this is just a charity file that we've set up, and worth just pointing out that we have updated this to the latest EPAC, and we've also applied the latest TPAC, and we'll be mentioning that in a bit more detail in a couple of minutes' time. But if you need some assistance with making sure that your files are up to date, then let us know in the chat field or in the Q&A, and we will point you in the right direction. So if I go into my accounts tab at the top and I go into assign mappings, we can see here we've got some codes that are unmapped. We're going to leave those alone for now because Phil's going to have a look at those later. But if we scroll down to our J codes, so this is the J section for charity funds, we can see that we have charity endowment funds, that's J01. So we can open that one up, and we can see here that we've actually got 20 different funds there. They're all split out into separate mapping. We do have an all funds at the top, but we wouldn't recommend sort of bunging everything into the all funds, because what you'll need to, that'll just create work for you later. So you'll need to manually create work to give yourself better analysis of your different funds. So what we'd recommend doing is analysing those out to save yourself work later into these different funds. And we'll look into this, how they filter through to the accounts a bit later. So Phil's going to be having a look at that with you a bit later. We've also got, I'm just going to collapse JO1. You've also got your transfers in and out. So we would recommend that you map to your transfer in and out funds, your mapping, rather than doing that through the funds analysis. You can right click. I'm just going to reopen this here. So this is your, sorry, you may not have seen that. This is your transfer in and out codes here. So definitely map your to transfer in and out codes there. That's going to give you the accuracy that you need in the file. We can also rename our endowment fund codes here. So we could right click and we could go into properties, and you can see here we've got the name. We could change that to whatever we like. That's going to update the description in the mapping. It won't update it on the face of the account, so you'll still need to update that on the corresponding row in the accounts. But what it will help you do is better identify your different funds within your mapping and also within your TB. Now, the predominant differences between Charity and Academy is within the K codes. So we've got the K codes here, which is for your income resources, but within Academy you also have predictably teaching schools. We've got KT 1 and 2 for direct and other income for teaching schools, and then you also have your equivalent Y codes down here. This is for your resources expended. So you've got your YT 1 and 2, which is for direct and other expenditure for teaching schools. What you may have just seen, which I'll go back to, is we also now have KB codes for boarding schools, and that's for your income. And then we have YB, which is for the expenditure for boarding schools. If you're not seeing that in your file, that's because we've only just added it within the latest TPAC, and that's the TPAC that accompanied the EPAC, EPCA 40503. So if you're not seeing those there, you do need to apply your TPAC. And again, let us know if you need guidance there. We can point you in the right direction. We can provide links on how to download the EPAC and TPAC from the knowledge base, and directions on how to apply those to your file. Because of course, just installing it won't necessarily update the file. You need to go through a process, so we can point you in the right direction there. If we return down to the Y codes, we go down to the Y61 and sort of down, we can see we've got Y61 down to 64. You'll notice there we've got activities for direct costs, but we've also got 4 at the top here that already have specific names for activities. So we put in high street development, marketing and tourism, etc. in there. They are not pre-populated in the template, so that's because we've done that in the wizard. So you don't actually need to right click and change the map description for that to be reflected here. That's actually within the wizard. So once you've got the wizard open, you have the funds tab here, which is under your general info. And you can see we've got charitable activities, and that's where we've put our 4 in there. Now in here, as you add one in, it will then add another line, and you can do that for, as if we go back to the mapping there, you can see we can go up to 12 of those. So for example, if I wanted to add in a new one and maybe call it catering, as you can see, it's now giving me the 6th row to keep going down to 12. If I set map code descriptions, that's going to be doing that over, there's a little dialogue that's appeared on my other screen. That's going to sort of run in the background. That's finished now by the looks of it. So if we were to just close and reopen our assigned mapping, I think it's still working away in the background there. So there we go, it's done it. So we can see that our number 5, sorry, is now called catering. So that's where you would update that description. You don't need to touch any properties in the assigned mapping. That is driven from here. So we can see the within this fund section of the general information tab, we can see that we've also got income and expenditure types. We're not going to run through this process in full here, but we're just going to highlight it for you. If we go back to our mapping, oh, bear with me. And we want to go down to, oh, sorry, folks. Right, there we go. Bit of a problem with my mouse. So you can see here we've got your expenditure types here within our Y61. And you might be noticing that we've got the pre-populated descriptions here, so rent and rates downwards. Going back to, as you can see, rent and rates all the way down to insurance here. So this is, as you can see in the blurb here, really, you've got up to 20 that you can populate in here. So those descriptions will be driven by what we have in the mapping. You might notice that we go down to 20 and then it's got 30. Well, actually, you can, if you want to, create new map numbers, so 21 to 29. But in terms of what is supported by default within the template, it would be up to 20. And then you can amend those expenditure descriptions in this second half of the funds tab. And then, as we've shown previously, that will then update in the assigned mappings. So that really brings me to the end of the initial demonstration that I wanted to show you. So I'm now going to hand over to Phil, and then we'll have a look at a bit more detail at the map numbers that are sitting there that are ready to be mapped, and a bit more detail at the funds.
Yes, thank you, Tom. I'm just going to quickly share my screen for you guys. Hopefully you should be able to see that appearing now. So we're going to focus on the balance sheet and its disclosures, and also the income statement, its disclosures. To do that, we're also going to obviously go through and map some of the codes that you can see on the left-hand side that Tom highlighted previously. So just to start, we're going to jump into our balance sheet on our set of financial statements. Don't worry too much about them not balancing at the moment. There's obviously an obvious reason for that. If you don't map everything, it's obviously not going to balance. Now, all we want to highlight really here is, again, those of you that are familiar with the corporate template will notice that the top half of the balance sheet is obviously very similar to the AccountsAdvanced template. The changes in regards to Charity and Academies is very much in the bottom half, where we've got the charity funds, have the breakdown of endowment funds, of which there are none in this file. We've got our restricted funds, and then we've got our unrestricted funds. For those of you who are obviously creating Academy files will be aware of restricted funds class 2, which would also be disclosed on this particular section of the balance sheet. Now, the figures in here are one thing that we notice when it comes to Charity and Academies is not, or one thing that's important is about knowing where these figures come from and how they get to this position. You'll notice I've also got the funds analysis open on this file, and that's going to be quite key when we're looking at this charity fund section. The figures that we can see in here are being driven completely from note 18, which is the statement of funds. And you can see in here we've got some designated funds. We haven't got anything in the brought forward at the moment. We're going to bring that in when we go through and do the mapping. We've also got general funds, and again, we haven't got a brought forward figure at this point. Now, I'm just going to go through back into the mapping and again look at those J codes that Tom highlighted during his section of this webinar. So we've got the J codes. We've got it's quite a clear split between endowment funds, restricted funds class 2, and then we've got our J10, which is just a header, and then obviously you can map any general funds and designated funds to J11 and J12. Now, our first map code we're just going to map is the general funds. So if I open up the general funds map code, as Tom already highlighted, we wouldn't recommend you use the all funds code. The reason for that will become a lot clearer when we go into our funds analysis worksheet webinar in a couple of weeks. But essentially what having all funds would, as we've already mentioned, plonks it all into one place. And then to get that split that we've got within our notes to the financial statements, so to get this split between general funds 1, 2, 3, obviously we would rename these in the instances of your files. But to get that split, ideally we want to be doing that at the mapping level, so that when it rolls forward, again, we've just got to remap, or we've just got to bring in the new figures for the next year. So I'm just going to quickly map in the code there to the general funds brought forward code, remembering to press apply. Obviously the figure doesn't update until we press apply, and we can see we've got 16,000 in on our first brought forward code. Now if I just jump back into the accounts, simply applying that map code, it will do absolutely nothing. As you can see, the file was refreshed, no figure has pulled through in there. And again, it's about understanding the process of this figure pulling through from the mapping into the financial statements. In a lot of, or in some instances, the notes are actually being populated from our funds analysis worksheet. So this is where, if you are changing mapping, if you're doing mapping whilst you've got your accounts open, it's always good to have the funds analysis open as well. So you can see I've got the wizard open, I've got the funds analysis open, I've also got the accounts open, just in the tabs at the bottom of the screen. If I open up the funds, just scroll down, again, we'll highlight the different sections of this during our funds analysis webinar. If I scroll down, we get to general funds section. We can see here that 16,000 is coming through on the funds analysis. And if I just jump straight back into the accounts now, I haven't changed anything. I've just scrolled down on the funds, but now you can see that figure pulling through. So when you're working with the J codes, and also with regards to the governance costs around Y6F and Y7F for the support side of the governance costs, it's just important to make sure that you also access the funds analysis because of the way that they filter through. Now, we've also got a couple of designated funds brought forward codes that we need to map. So again, we've got two different, we've got farmers market, we've got learning and education. So I'll just open up funds analysis 1 for our first brought forward. And then I'd open up designated funds 2 for the second brought forward code. And again, pressing the apply button will update that mapping. And if I jump back in again, we'll see that that won't automatically update until we jump into the funds analysis. And it is as simple as that, just clicking into the funds analysis and then back into the accounts document will then update that information. Making those changes, if we jump quickly back into our statement of financial position, that's the wrong one, statement of financial position, you can see that the figures here have updated. There wasn't a prior year figure initially when we were first in there, but the designated funds will be located within the unrestricted section of this charity fund. So there's not a separate row within the charity fund section for designated funds. They will all go within unrestricted funds, which is why when we're looking in the mapping, we have that almost like a subheading of unrestricted funds. So anything from or anything beneath that J10 code, so J11, J12, will be included within unrestricted funds when we're looking at the balance sheet. So again, it's just very important to make sure that we're not only looking at, or when we're doing the mapping, we're not just going straight into the accounts, we're going to the funds and into the financial statements. Now, that is in terms of the balance sheet side. The J codes are obviously the one area that is important in terms, or in comparison to the AccountsAdvanced corporate template for those that do or use both templates. We're now going to move up to the statement of financial position. And the first thing that we can highlight here is quite clearly that we've got a restricted funds column and in our total funds for the current year. And again, it is important to know how this information pulls through into these two columns rather than just coming through and us having to allocate it out manually. It's all done completely through the mapping process. We're going to look at donations and legacies just for this example. So if I go down to note 3, we can see all of the SOFA notes will have that same unrestricted funds column. restricted funds, and then we've got restricted funds class 2, again, more for academy files, and then we've got endowment funds, again, if they existed within this file. And now, just to give you, again, an idea of how this works, we go down to our donations. We've got a general donations. And we've also got a high street improvements donations. Now, these donations, again, would need to, it's quite straightforward. We just go down, we've got K11, we've got charity donations. We're just picking the first one for our first donation and the second one for the second donation. But what we need to make sure is that we are actually splitting these between the correct fund types when we're going through and mapping those. For those of you that were regular users of the V3 charity or academy templates, would have been quite familiar with a 00 code. So rather than K11.01.00.01 being the first code, you'd have also had a .00 code. And then you would have gone into the funds analysis and allocated out that figure between restricted and unrestricted and endowment funds. That has been removed, as I'm sure hopefully you guys are aware of now. That's been removed as part of the changeover to the AccountsAdvanced template. So again, it is important to make sure that we're making that or splitting our figures between the appropriate funds. Now, again, one thing that I've seen personally in previous or from previous experience is that in some instances we just have donations as one code, and we've got to go in and we're going, okay, part of this is restricted funds, part of this is general funds. That's where some of the adjustments options within CaseWare. So again, outside of the mapping where we can make adjusting journal entries, we can create new nominal codes, and I would create those codes to split between general funds, restricted funds, if it is the case that all of your donations are just on one nominal code, but you need to split it. It is imperative that we have that split so that they come through in the right columns on our statement of financial activities. Now, in terms of mapping, again, I just drag and drop. We've got general funds, donations, and I could, again, I'm not going to put it on to number 1. I'm going to go down to number 2. This one's to do with high street improvements. We can see at the end it's got just a shortened restricted funds. So I'm going to chuck that on the restricted funds map code. Again, I'll jump back into the accounts. Now, with this, in this instance, we're not going to go into the funds analysis because the information will pull directly into the accounts. Again, knowing which ones pull through to the funds and which ones don't, there is quite a handy column on the right hand side where we can see the different map numbers. But again, we'll highlight that in a bit more detail in 3 weeks' time with our funds analysis webinar. But you saw that information pulled straight through into our donations row on this section. And if we go up to the financial activities, this figure will have updated. Now, one thing to be aware of, and I'm sure you're probably thinking, well, why have we put them in separate map codes if they're going to come through in the same row? So why have we used donations 1 and donations 2? The reason for that is the question mark icon up here will allow us to include a detailed analysis of the donations. So if I just add in a detailed analysis of the donations, again, if we want to, we can manually split them out, which means that, and we can also do that within the face of the sofa as well. So it's always important to make sure that we split them out. Again, if you're using that detailed analysis, it's a lot easier to just use the figures that you've already mapped into each of the donations rather than going through the hassle of having to work it out afterwards. Now, the final area, again, that will be applicable across the K11s, K12s, K13s. We're all looking at all the voluntary incomes here. And as Tom has already mentioned, the various different income types, we can see we've got the various headings that Tom added in previously down to the catering, the K25. Now, just looking at the final difference with regards to the mapping, we go past the W and the X codes straight down to the Y codes. Again, Tom has highlighted that we've got, or we can add in our own different headings. So in these direct costs, we can add in the different heading types: rents and rates, equipment, equipment repairs, hires, whatever. One thing to be aware of in terms of your when you're looking at charitable activities is, again, there is a split between the Y6 codes for the direct costs and the Y7 codes. So Y70, Y71, all the way down to Y7G are for the support costs. So again, it is important to have that split between the direct costs and the support costs when you're going through and doing your mapping. That is important both in terms of, or is most important when it comes to the notes to the financial statements again. And it wouldn't, again, be a case of splitting that information out on the funds analysis. You're doing this all within the mapping itself. So we're just going to go into, we've got, I'll just quickly show direct costs, rents and rates, unrestricted. So we go direct costs, rent and rates. Just quickly map that unrestricted. So we're going to, again, the general funds. You will have noticed in this instance that we don't have a full name. We just got end, rest, est, general. In some instances, we shorten the names just because the map code's obviously already quite long with direct activity for rent and rates. It does exactly the same thing. Once you get the, or once you are aware that you obviously 01 is endowment funds, 02 is restricted funds, 04 is general funds, it doesn't matter whether you're looking at one of the incomes, whether you're looking at one of the expenses, doesn't matter if you're looking at direct costs, support costs, it will always be exactly the same. There is that common mapping mask across all of the academy and the charity files, whereby if it ends in 04, that is always going to be a general fund. If it ends in 02, it's going to be a restricted fund. Our last one, we got rent and rates, farmers market. So again, I'll open up Y63, go rent and rates, and we can just jump into, we're going to say endowment funds, just for this instance. Realistically, it's probably more likely to be restricted funds, but just to show you how that affects the financial statements. You can see that any time that we map, or if we have an endowment fund, CaseWare will automatically populate the endowment fund or bring through the endowment funds column. Now we have just mapped in charitable activities. We can see that will come through in note 9. And again, this is where it's important to have that split between restricted funds, unrestricted funds, and endowment funds, because we've got the summary by fund type based on our various expenditures. But also, more importantly, if I scroll down to our within our analysis of expenditure by activities, we can include a split between the direct costs and the support costs. So I'll just carry on scrolling down. I can have an analysis of support costs, which is just turned on using the tick boxes at the top. And again, it's just useful to have, or if we've done that split correctly within the mapping, that all that information will filter through the way that we're expecting it to within our notes to the accounts. Now, again, even though this information is filtering straight through into the accounts, again, it is important to jump back into the funds analysis and then jump back into the accounts, because there are some, again, as we'll see on our funds analysis webinar, there are some aspects of it regarding income and expenditure that will pull through directly, or will go into the funds analysis and then into the account. So to make sure that the income and expenditure sections of the statement of funds are up to date when you're going through and adding income and expenditure, so the K and Y codes, always jump again back into the funds analysis in that instance. So it's just a quick overview of the main areas, the J codes, the K codes, the Y codes. What I would say is, if there are any areas where people have specific questions on mapping within Charity and Academy files, please feel free to add that into the chat or into the feedback that you'll get at the end of the webinar, and we can come back to you and give you some specific advice regarding any questions that you have. I'm now going to pass you over to Tom, just to see if there are any questions.
Thanks, Phil. So yes, we've got a few questions. We are obviously aware that we are actually out of time really, but we're going to try and shoehorn in a couple of questions because we've got some that have come in. You can see there how to submit your questions if you'd like to, and we can always get back to you after the webinar if we don't get a chance to answer it. The first one is, if all of my endowment funds are on a single nominal code, should I map this to the all endowment funds map code or split the code between the different funds? So I'll cover that because I mentioned that briefly at the beginning of the presentation. So just to confirm, yes, we would recommend splitting it out. If you map it to all funds, then it will create work for you later on if you need to analyze out those figures. So if you've got one nominal code, we'd recommend creating additional nominal codes, and then you can use the adjusting entries feature that Phil showed you earlier to move between those funds so that you can map them separately. If you need more guidance on that, then let us know and we can point you in the right direction. Seems to be my phrase of the day. I'll just go through, I'll pick one of the other ones that we've got here. So one for you, Phil, I think. Can I change the order of the unrestricted and restricted columns in the SOFA?
Yes, sorry, just quickly. I believe this was referring to the fact that we got restricted, unrestricted endowment. If we jump into the wizard, within the accounts format section, there is an option here to change the column settings. So default unrestricted, restricted endowment. We can go endowment, restricted, unrestricted. Obviously, if there aren't endowments, it will just have restricted and unrestricted. So it's just the radio buttons on the disclosure format section within the accounts format area of the wizard.
Lovely, thank you very much. So yeah, as we run over by a couple of minutes, we will produce a Q&A document. There are other questions that are floating about, so we'll produce a Q&A document, and that will be on the knowledge base with the recording in the next couple of days. You can also, or we very much appreciate it if you fill in the survey, which will pop up at the end. That will also be in the follow-up email, and you can put any additional questions that you have in there as well. So if we jump to the next slide, we can see our upcoming webinar schedule there. This is being updated all the time. So if you go to caseware.co.uk/events, you'll see our full list of upcoming webinars and the agendas there. You can also register to attend. But as Phil mentioned a few times earlier, we've got the funds worksheet webinar coming up towards the end of the month. So that's kind of rounding off the Charity and Academy series of webinars. And then we've got, as I say, more being added, but Companies House filing and Directors Report editing coming up at the beginning of September. On the next slide, I believe we've just got a confirmation of how to reach the events page if you are already browsing the website. So that is the resources section and the events. Again, you can view the agendas there and register to attend. Once we've run a webinar, they then become available on YouTube as well as our knowledge base. They become available on our client services YouTube channel. We have a webinars playlist, as well as lots of other quick vids and other video content on there. So if you go to the Client Services CaseWare UK Limited YouTube channel, you can subscribe and also adjust your notifications there so that we can let you know when new videos are added, which is regularly. But we also have, as I say, webinars are added there once they have been broadcast. If you wanted to be kept up to date with the latest news within the business, including upcoming webinars, then please visit Client Services CaseWare UK Limited on LinkedIn, and you can follow us there. Finally, we've got the knowledge base, which hopefully is a familiar destination for you. That's kb.caseware.co.uk, and that is where we have not only recordings of webinars and Q&A documents, but lots of articles and links to our YouTube videos, as well as the download area. So again, just to highlight that if you wanted to download the latest EPAC and TPAC, then you go to the download area there. If you can't see that, then it may be to do with your level of access, so you can speak to your nearest super user. So that brings us to the end of today's session. Thank you for joining us today. And as I say, please fill in the survey and we will get back to you with answers to any questions. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, and we'll see you on the next webinar.
Cheers, thanks guys.